Hi there. Yeah, my name is Andrew Gage. For those I haven't met yet, I'm a staff lawyer with West Coast Environmental Law. I would like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'm here to talk to you about our Climate Law in Our Hands project and how BC local governments can protect your taxpayers at the same time as fighting climate change. When I was a kid, that's me on the right, growing up in Victoria, my grandparents' house was a block away from Dallas Road, and I used to play on the beaches below the cliffs. And since then, I've been amazed at how quickly erosion has pushed back those cliffs and the work that Victoria has had to do to stop them. We tend to think that climate change is happening to someone else. Polar bears, maybe, Pacific Islanders, but every community in BC is dealing with climate change, whether we realize it yet or not. The provincial government has estimated that Metro Vancouver municipalities will need to spend $9.5 billion between now and 2100, about $100 million per year, to deal with rising sea levels alone, not counting other climate impacts. And just last October, we had a taste of that when the city of Vancouver debated whether or not to spend $800 million on a storm surge protector to protect False Creek. We got wildfires, summer droughts, mountain pine beetle, 100-year storm events coming every 20 years, landslides, loss of snowpack. These are just a few of the climate impacts that your engineers, planners, and councils need to address. And I don't know about you, but that scares me because we're only at like a 1-degree global temperature increase right now, and it's going to get a lot hotter. The infrastructure that you're building, seawalls, roads, stormwater systems, have to last the next 30, 50, or more years. Quick show of hands, whose communities have climate adaptation plans in place already? Who knows how much they're going to cost to implement? Right now the assumption is that 100% of the cost for that adaptation, for that building climate resilient systems, lies with taxpayers. That's hundreds of millions of dollars that BC communities just don't have. Think of what that's going to do to your budgets. We need a new conversation. We need to recognize that a relatively small number of fossil fuel companies have played a major role in causing the climate crisis. They're not the only players, but there are major players that have made hundreds of billions of dollars of profits in the process, some of the wealthiest companies in the world, and they don't plan to pay for you to adapt to climate change or for the costs that your communities are suffering. Just 20 companies are responsible through their operations and their products for almost 30% of the human-caused greenhouse gases in the global atmosphere today. And they've known since the 1960s that their products are causing these impacts. On the 25th of January, West Coast Environmental Law and more than 50 other BC-based groups wrote to all of BC's local governments asking you to take action to hold the fossil fuel companies accountable for their fair share of local climate impacts. We want you to talk about how your communities are suffering from climate change, and then start a conversation about the role of the fossil fuel industry in that, in causing those impacts. In the short term, that just means writing a letter, asking these companies, asking the 20 companies I referenced, whether they recognize that they owe a fair share of the cost your communities are incurring. Sample letters and addresses for the companies are available at www.climatelawinourhands.org. But the act of publicly demanding accountability is huge. It starts a crucial conversation about whether our communities alone have to pay or if the fossil fuel industry bears some of the share. It's a conversation that the companies desperately want to avoid because it goes right to the fact that their products are harming our communities. In the longer term, we do hope that you will consider the possibility of coming together and bringing a class action on behalf of all of BC's local governments to confirm the legal obligations of these fossil fuel companies to pay their fair share. Those costs are only going to grow, and we need answers to those questions. But sending a letter is a cheap and easy first step and in no way commits you to litigation. Demanding that the fossil fuel companies pay their fair share of climate impacts is fiscally responsible, rather than just passing those expenses on to taxpayers. But it's also absolutely critical in terms of fighting climate change. It's about making the true costs of the fossil fuel economy visible. The world's got a huge job ahead of it, transitioning to a sustainable economy, and it's going to be a whole lot more difficult if there's a huge industry that believes it can make massive profits without cleaning up its mess. renewable energy is always going to be at a disadvantage if it needs to compete with an energy industry that doesn't believe it needs to pay its fair share, that has an economic incentive to keep doing it, what it's been doing. And our communities have the power to insist that those companies clean up after themselves. When fossil fuel companies and their investors and the governments that benefit from them know that communities are demanding financial accountability, then they will begin to have a real economic incentive to move away from the fossil fuel path and down the path towards a sustainable economy. Demanding accountability from the fossil fuel industry is one of the most important things that local governments can do to send a global message. This isn't just about the emissions that are occurring in our communities or even about Canada's 2% of global emissions. It's about holding the global fossil fuel industry accountable and creating consequences for the almost 30% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions that those 20 companies have caused. BC communities have long been leaders in climate action. Many signed on to the Climate Action Charter. Others have detailed climate plans and pledges to work to 100% renewable energy. We need one more part of leadership, and that's demanding accountability from an industry that right now has avoided accountability. You're here because you believe that local governments have the power to build a better world. We want to work with you to bring BC communities together to stand up and tell the world's fossil fuel companies that their business model hurts our communities and that it's time that they take some responsibility.